we have 30 minutes for questions. Who wants to start? We can group maybe 3 or 4 questions together. Here you go.
Thank you for the excellent overview. Very well done. I'm Sue Schramm. I'm with ACDI VOCA, but I'm also on the ICARDA board. My question relates to the 3 funding windows that you mentioned. In a time of fiscal stress, as well as the enormous opportunity that we see, it would seem to make sense to me to keep all of the 3 windows open and hopefully the money flowing in from all 3. I've been a little bit concerned hearing something about potentially closing window 3, which is concerning to me. So I had a question about how you're coming out on that. To me, in an area of accountability and transparency, and our great partner organizations such as IFAD and so on, they need to be accountable for their expenditures as well. So I think they're eager to invest, but I'm hoping we can keep window 3 open. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question from somebody who really knows CGIAR. All right. Okay. Why don't we finish this side? Emmy.
To open the door, Emmy Simmons, now on the IITA board and the AVRDC board. And I have one question to follow up on Sue's question, which has to do with funding in window 3. And note that, in fact, there is a lot of money now going into the system which wasn't talked about at all in your chart. And indeed, much of the growth I suspect that you saw, for example, the government of Mexico grant directly to CIMMYT, accounts for some of that energy and excitement that you actually saw in the field. So what kind of strategy are you evolving to kind of take into account the entire envelope of funding and to make that a bit more integrated than it currently is? That's my first question. And I guess then the second question has to do with the independent evaluation arrangement. Again, trying to push down overhead costs, but at the same time adding what's going to be a pretty significant overhead cost for the system, and where you feel that that sort of funding initiative is going to come from.
Thank you, Emmy. There's a hand in the middle of this side. Yes.
Brian Bruns, consulting sociologist, work on water and such. Question and related to impact is about kind of open access publishing and such, and to what extent are you thinking about more things? And I recognize there's a lot the CG centers already do, but ways of enhancing access to research, both results of CG's own research, and as an important organization of scientists and associated with national centers, who are often some of the ones who suffer from the problems of the current broken business models. And obviously The Economist had yet another article this week on some of the debates about open access and what else might be done. Thank you.
Okay, well, why don't we start with the 3 questions. There were 3 windows and plus bilateral funding. The independent evaluation seems to me that has become pretty heavy right now, and also the open access to CGIAR's publication knowledge. Go ahead.
Did you say it on the ICARDA board? Yeah, ICARDA is of course going through a rather difficult time. They are the center in Syria. They have just evacuated there. I'm told by the DG and board chair that they are in okay shape, but obviously it is a reminder that we all work in very difficult environments. These things happen one-off, and they're far enough spaced from each other that you don't think of it as a pattern, but it keeps happening. I was just at Africa Rice that went through a similar crisis about 10 years ago. So yes, I think ICARDA is handling this in an admirable way, but obviously they're going through a very difficult period. So what can I say? We have our support, if you like. The windows, yes, I used a few slides from our colleagues at the fund office that focused on the CGIAR fund, the fund that they manage. My overall numbers for the $850 million, for instance, that of course is including all the bilateral funds and the window 3 funds. We do have a bit of an exercise to bring together the thinking on these windows, it is frankly the most confusing issue that I've seen since I took this role, because I read all the documents and I thought I knew what these windows were for, and then I speak to people and everybody else has a different idea. So it's funny. We have to think about this. The original design for Window 3 was that it would provide donors with an opportunity to provide unrestricted support to centers. The de facto use of Window 3 is that restricted projects come through the fund to centers using Window 3. And we have to sort of harmonize whether that is a good idea or not a good idea. There are certainly donors that would want to stop restricted projects coming through a mechanism that was supposed to be there for unrestricted support. Centers, I think, generally say, well, yeah, it would be great to get unrestricted support, but we're not getting it, so we'd rather get bilateral support this way. Let's not endanger that. And then there are other complicating factors like the African Development Bank that would very much like, we understand, to support CRPs, but they don't have a global mandate. They can only support in Africa. So they say we can't support through Window 2, so we have to do something else. So this is frankly a bit complicated. I don't think there is any intent, from our side at least, to close Window 3. But we do have to clean up a little bit these things of what is all this used for. And I do have sometimes discussions with folks that say, you know, you in the fund raise money for Window 1 and 2, and we in the centers raise money for bilateral or Window 3 projects. That, frankly, I find silly as well. Remember that the original intent for the reform was to go from, say, 3,000 bilateral projects to a very much smaller number of CRPs plus bilateral projects. Let's just say we go from 3,000 to 300, a much more manageable system. And of course, when I speak with Tony Simons, he says, we have actually made progress. We're not accepting small projects anymore. Our minimum size is now $100,000. That's a lot of projects for a $900 million organization. But of course, a $100,000 project is not the same as a $50 million grant from the Gates Foundation. So let me just say that there will definitely be a role for bilateral funds, that we should have enough money in Window 1 and 2 to provide that stable and relatively unrestricted core funding that the centers need, and that we need to have a bit more discussion on, now that we've worked for a few years with these windows, how we redefine them or how we adjust them. And for instance, personally, I think we could allow donors to allocate money to, say, Africa or Asia within the rice program, or to cassava within the roots and tuber program. But that has not yet been agreed, so we should discuss how that works and what the pros and cons are. That's on windows, and I think that also then answers Emmy's first question. Does it, Emmy? Yeah. All right, you're sort of behind the pillar here, but I could hear you. Yes, yes, yes. Then you spoke about the independent evaluation arrangement. And frankly, people mostly talk about this as overhead, money, yada yada. I think we actually need them. We need them for our own credibility. It doesn't have to be a large cost. Frankly, I think this is intricately linked to the idea that we would have much more measurable, much more monitorable, outcomes that we can monitor quantitatively, and that we actually put in our performance agreements. Then I would imagine centers and CRPs would have to monitor their own outcomes, like they currently monitor their expenses. Then somebody from the outside will have to be able to come and say, is your system any good? Just like you now would have accountants. That's the role of the independent evaluation arrangement. And frankly, that shouldn't be all that expensive. It would be very different than the former EPMRs, which were groups of people that had expert judgment. If we shift to a system where we monitor agreed quantitative outcomes, all this becomes much more like what we have come to find very normal for finance, say. And finally, I also see an important role for ISPC's SPIA, the Panel on Impact Assessment, and I'm very pleased that Gates and DFID and possibly USAID are interested in beefing that up, so that we also have a semi-independent group that can indeed do baselines, because centers might want to lowball their outcomes, is of course a natural suspicion, or that can make that link between outcomes, the ones that we can hold centers accountable for, and the final impact that we are of course all interested in. So center's own monitoring, independent verification of that through the IEA, and impact assessment through SPIA, and center-based impact assessment economist, I think are three key parts of our monitoring of performance that I find in principle quite logically hanging together, not necessarily expensive, and a key ingredient for indeed having the confidence of donors that the money we get gets spent the way it was supposed to. I actually think that there are many ways where we can cut in the way we do our research more efficiently and effectively. We tend to have a lot of focus on the number of board members and the number of trips we take. I think there's a lot more scope for making the research we do more effective, like better programming with partners, fewer layers of coordination within the programs, where we can actually, it's not so visible, but we could gain orders of magnitude more and make our research better. Finally, Brian, the open access question. I think actually data generally, knowledge management, is one of the key areas where we could do more shared standards at the very least, shared systems potentially, or shared services. And we have a workshop on that in September 11th and 12th in Montpellier, because I think indeed moving towards more open systems for how we hold all our data and how we share them with the users, not only for our publications, but also for our data sets, is a trend, if you like. I've talked generally about 15 CRPs. It's actually 15 plus 1, as you've seen in my slides. We're quite proud that we have a CRP-like structure to support the gene banks, the jewels in the crown that we have come to take a lot more seriously since Uma told us that they were being neglected. So there is a $100 million investment in the operation and maintenance of the gene banks, but that also includes a better system, Genesis, GeneSys, a system through which people can have access to all the accessions in all the gene banks, and on that you can then build an integrated breeding platform, a shared bioinformatics group, open access publishing. There are a series of things in the area of data and information that are high potential, unexplored territory. High on the agenda. Not a lot of action yet.
Let's come to the second round, but I'm really glad to hear that the Windows 3 will remain to be open. I'm also glad to hear that we needed to reduce the cost of this independent evaluation arrangement, because initially I heard that there's a number like 2% has to be used for evaluation, and I asked what is the benchmark. It's FAO. FAO uses 2%. But the CGIAR is a research organization. It's not an implementation agency. So 2% on top of another 2% on consortium overhead, it's pretty heavy. So I'm very glad to hear these 2 points. Okay, let's come to the second round. Monty, Oma, okay, Eugenio. All right, let's start with Monty.
Thank you very much. Let me start by saying that I was present at the creation of the CGIAR system, and this, for the information of those people here, happened when David Bell, the vice president of the Ford Foundation, came to the World Bank in a meeting with McNamara, myself, and Warren Baum, said that the foundations could no longer afford to maintain the research center in Mexico and in the Philippines. I think there were $9 million then. And he would like the bank to move in and do something about setting up a system and management, and also finance the expansion of the new research centers. At that time, there was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm for agricultural research because of the results that had come from Mexico and later the Philippines, Norman Borlaug and his colleagues. So McNamara turned to Baum and myself and said, do something about it. So the CGIAR was created without an institutional framework. We were much more concerned about the funding and how to bring the bilateral and multilateral donors together and so forth and so forth. And of course, since then, it's gone from strength to strength with many ups and downs. But I think one of the two big changes, the global picture that are that I think need to be considered. One is, I think that today most of the agricultural research in the world, funding, is done in the private sector. Only got to look at Bayer, Syngenta, Monsanto, what they are doing. And their budgets absolutely dwarf the public sector budgets. So I think it's very hard to see how you can proceed without paying due account, taking due account. And I know this raises lots of problems, but I think they simply have to be considered. Second thing, I think a little more fundamental, is what's happened over the last 40 or 50 years with a big increase in population, that soon there'll be more people in the cities in developing countries, if they're not now, than in the rural areas. This may call for an entirely different approach to agricultural development, urban agriculture or something like that, and less focus on the small farmer, but much more the supply chain. This is one of the big changes from my time when we instituted the whole rural development approach at the World Bank.
Well, Monty, I think there's two challenges well stated, right? So, Omar. Just speak to the microphone.
It's very nice to see Monty, who I don't see, recruited me in the World Bank. So he has a great sense of history about rural development and agriculture and the World Bank's role in it, including in the foundation of the CGIAR. First of all, congratulations. It's good that the CGIAR has a CEO, and it's a major job you have. One thing I was going to suggest to you, since you mentioned the gender program, as you know, there was a big conference organized in India on gender that I was involved with, together with Jackie and many others. And there is a thought of creating a network of people working on gender in agriculture, involving a number of international organizations as well as the national systems. So I have the honor of being asked to represent Asia, IFPRI, on that group. And we had a meeting yesterday, and we were thinking about what are the kinds of things that women and men who've been working on gender issues could do to have a bigger impact. So one of the ideas that I was going to suggest, and I haven't even talked to Jackie about it, but I will certainly send her an email. Perhaps you could have this small network, which is very much in the process of being formed at the moment, to look at the CG's gender programs in the centers and see the extent to which they are being mainstreamed. So you will have, you will have an outsider's view, and maybe that will provide some input into how the programs could be made, how gender could be made much more mainstream from a point of view which comes from outside the CG system.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Uma. Eugenio.
Thank you. Let me get out of the column so I can see you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Good luck in your new job. I was at IFPRI about 9 years ago. I came back after 9 years at the IDB at the Board of Executive Directors. We had the opportunity of negotiate the increase of the capital of the bank from $100 billion to 170. So let me, I'd like to comment on two things, because we had a lot of that debate related to a strategic reserve framework and the issue of partnerships. A strategic reserve framework, the main point there, at least in the negotiation that we had, is the objectives of the industrialized countries and the developing countries in these organizations may or may not coincide. So one of the main issues is, a lot of them coincide, but not all of them. So the main issue is who's defining the objectives of the strategic reserve framework. That's the first level. The second level is, once defined, are you going to go to a specific target or you're going to track them down? What I found in these negotiations, a lot of there is some sort of Soviet mentality, Soviet planning mentality. You know, you want to have hard targets, and then you want to get to that. It's better to have an objective and track the movement forward instead of having hard targets. You may need 2 or 3 hard targets and then basically a way of tracking that down. So that's the issue on objectives. The issue of partnerships, my sense is that, again, it's related to whether or not objectives may or may not coincide. If the objectives of some of the partners are exactly the same as the CGIAR, then may not be a problem. But the CGIAR is covering objectives that not other people are covering. Therefore, the issue is when you get into a partnership, they are expecting resources to do something that they may not be doing. So part of the discomfort or not happiness is not because the CGIAR system may not be delivering. It's that they were thinking that they are going to get some money out of this in order to do some things that they would not have done otherwise. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we should, okay, why don't we have the second round to be answered by Frank, then we go to maybe the last round. Frank, to the 3 questions, Monty, Omar, and Eugenio.
Well, I'm privileged to hear your perspective. You've certainly had a chance to see more of this whole trajectory than I have. I've met Mr. McNamara also once or twice, and he had also very interesting stories to share. It's certainly true that the private sector in the overall agriculture picture is dominating research. But it is a little bit linking to the last question, what objectives do they have, and what are the objectives of the people we serve? It's, I think, quite similar as in health. We say, yes, we have very large pharma companies, but their research objectives are focused on the people who can pay for their products. So they focus on heart disease and cancer. They're not focusing on the neglected diseases. And that was a very good reason for the world to then focus on the neglected diseases. In agriculture, the picture isn't as clear-cut because there's, rice and wheat that is relevant for poor people as well as for farmers in Nebraska. But I do think our focus on smallholder farmers and poverty leads to a different set of objectives that we can pursue. And the central role of the smallholder farmer is, I think, a guide to how those objectives are going to differ from the private sector. Now, that said, we do realize we need a much stronger partnership with the private sector. They have intellectual property that could be used for our work. And you can see, luckily, that more and more of those partnerships are formed. They're also still quite small. Last March, we adopted a new set of intellectual property principles, intellectual asset principles, which changed the picture from we are 100% in the public domain to something a bit closer to what Gates calls the open access principle, where they say, look, we can work with the private sector. We recognize that then they have to make money. So the Gates Foundation, for instance, says, if we work with a private sector partner, maybe they can have the license and make money for developed markets, but we will at the same time make a deal with them that we have open access for the people we want to serve in, take the list of the World Bank's least developed countries, those countries. So a negotiated deal through licensing. Our investors aren't all on the same page for that. We have 60% of our funding from the EU, where the view on the private sector's role in research and on GMOs, for instance, is quite different than the one here. So we're balancing a fairly difficult act there. Our IP principles open the door for restricted licensing, open the door for partnerships with the private sector if there is good justification. So that is at least the beginning of a mechanism where we can work with the private sector in a way that they don't just have to give up their IP to us who do the good things with it, but where we potentially could invest together. But they're fairly baby steps, and we haven't quite taken too many test cases to the farm, so to speak. For cities, I think while our focus is clearly on rural poverty reduction, we do also recognize that there's a new role of cities. We have some peri-urban agriculture in some of our programs, but particularly I think value chains are a staple in the research programs now. Wouldn't you say so, Schengen, so access to market and value change has become a very large part of our work. And I think that is one way to recognize this very different situation, not only of the urban population, but also where small farmers find themselves. The way out of poverty in the end might be that they sell fruits to Coca-Cola, or that they turn their business into something that indeed it has access to market. If I leave it at that, Uma, specifically on gender, I'm not sure exactly which network you are talking about, because Jackie, the CGIAR, have set up a network on gender and agriculture. Okay. Well, the one that is... And Jackie Ashby is our gender long-term consultant, basically consortium staff. And there is also a network of gender and agriculture experts that are having at least partly those objectives, and they're actually meeting at the Gates Foundation this week in Seattle to help do some research agenda development, to basically tell CRPs, look, we think as gender experts that these are effective ways of addressing some of these issues that you should really take into account across the CRPs. And then when we ask the CRPs to take those into account, we will also have external evaluation of how well they do that. So the mechanism I was alluding to would be basically competitive research without writing separate proposals and setting up separate mechanisms. I have a high hope that that will bring some of those changes really into the design of the programs and fund it. No, I think it's a great suggestion. Yes, I wasn't rejecting your suggestion, far from it. I was thinking it's a great idea. Yes, and I was... Okay, that will be a great help, because in many of the areas that is the challenge we have. How do we link up in a proper way with our partners? And it is also why I am so hopeful that the CADAP process indeed is one where we could really engage, because often our consultations with partners are talk shops that, you know, share good intentions, don't see results. So we do need to find ways to really link up with investment strategies in countries to engage in a way that our results can be picked up.
I think building countries' capacity probably is the best way to do. Otherwise, CGIAR goes to different nods to track what are they doing or how they have been doing on gender. That could be very, very controversial. Anyway, so Eugenio's question.
Yes, on whether we want a Soviet-style planning system.
Central planning.
Well, I come from the Netherlands, where, you know, when I was here in this country and we had the Healthcare Act last year, and people were talking about socialized medicine in Europe, I actually felt quite comfortable with socialized medicine. I say, yeah, actually, I want socialized medicine. So in that sense, yes, I probably want a socialized planning system. Well, all joking aside, the SRF, I mean, clearly we have different schools of thought, and you could see that in these different versions of the SRF. I mean, maybe in this house there are people who indeed believe more. If you bring enough economists in the room, they would probably have more confidence in an economic modeling approach to this whole system. If you bring enough other social scientists in the room, they would probably believe a more political economy approach to this would work better. Our view now is that we'll end up somewhere in the middle. We'll recognize the ISPC white paper on priority setting, I think, is a nice blend of these ideas. Yes, we need solid scientific information for some of our decision making. On the other hand, we recognize in the end priority setting is a political managerial process. Let's try and have some of both, and you know, we're still speaking about our ambitions, so you know, you can't fold those. Once we've done it and you see it's wrong, we can try and we'll also do this, let me say more seriously. I think we should do this iteratively, not one-off, this is how we're going to do this. There's always going to be something wrong here. So we'll try and learn by doing. I like the idea of a learning system here, and do this gradually. If we do this once or twice, we'll quickly get to what the really difficult issues are and then hone in on those.
But by the way,
doing,
there's
though.
a difference between central planning and being socialist. So socialist could have democracy, and democracy could also be.
You also said some of the partnerships are not successful because those partners all wanted our money. And I think, yeah, and maybe we should share it more enthusiastically with them. Because, you know, when we say we have 200 great partners and they together have 10% of our budget, you know, the discussion ends right there, you know. People don't take you serious. So yes, we'll have to be more generous in sharing our budget. And I'm hoping that, you know, when you come from a situation where the budgets are flat and everybody has to fire staff, and that's not the kind of environment to sort of share your budget more generally with partners. But now that our budget go up, we'd better take into account that partners need to have a larger stake in budgets. Just anecdotally, I'll tell you, when I designed the challenge program on water and food, I used some rules I copied from more European framework research programs and said every single project has to have 33% of its budget to national partners. Every project has to have at least one of the work packages led by a national partner. Now, that was just to try and force a bit of change. In the end of the first round of projects awarded to the challenge program participants, almost half, so well more than our minimum, went to national partners, and partners were a lot happier. Now, in the current environment, it's going to be a difficult discussion. And people also tell me, look, of certain core budgets, maybe the partners get only 5 or 10%. Of our bilateral projects, partners get very much closer to 30%. We need to have a lot more discussion. It's not just money, I'm sure, but if, you know, the money can be a stumbling block for further discussion, that as well.
Okay. David. Any other hands here? So far, the IFPRI staff
Thank you.
has been very cautious.
Thank you very much, David Lambert. You have touched all around this, but could you bring into sharper focus the issue of seeds in the new order of things, its relative importance, seed research, the importance of new traits in a changing climate and the political overtones there, and the importance of science-based regulations on seeds? Your perspective on that whole question.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, if not, Frank, so how can we really move the regulatory framework to make sure that some of the...
But also I think first you asked, I mean, you didn't hear me speak much about our traditional heartland. You called it seeds, I think generally we call it germplasm improvement. That is still our core business, right? And if you go from center to center, you see how rapidly that business is changing. I gave a few examples that they're all working with molecular breeding now. The marker-assisted selection has become fairly commonplace. I saw CIAT's transformation platform, very much, by the way, a skill that they have imported from the private sector by getting people who have done this before elsewhere. So all of our commodity programs have very ambitious programs for improvement, if you like, and doubling yields as a very generic. I mean, when Ken Kasman sits at the table when we discussed Rio +20, he said, look, we all have these environmental objectives, but even so we'll have to double yields, or especially if we want to reduce our environmental footprint, we also have to double yields. It's absolutely everywhere. In addition to that, I think, more when we start to think about delivery, the seed industry itself has become quite central to our interests, and the Gates Foundation is investing large amounts of money in that. Many of our centers are involved in that. How do we, it partly comes from, before we just said the international centers hand over these innovations to the national systems. In many cases we realize that those may be seed companies, or in Africa we need to be involved in developing an active and viable seed industry. I see that very much on the table. And of course then, you know, we should ask Schengen this, but a policy framework is part and parcel of that. I mean, yesterday was at USAID, and how they think of the country level agreements that the G8 now is coming up with is the commitment asked from countries is to make the commitment to change their policy environment, advised by organizations like IFPRI, the private sector to come in to make the accompanying investments, the donors to have aligned investments in countries to realize these investment programs that countries have been drawing up through processes like CADEP. It sounds very neat. It is pretty neat if we can make it work. And that's sort of the outside environment that I think we have to plug into. More than before, maybe, we're not just focused on science and delivering improved varieties. We have to do that against this context, in this environment where these things have to fit together. So when I speak about partnerships, it's sort of a bit of a buzzword covering a whole series of those things, from the private sector to engaging more with those other larger processes that in the end will allow us to be effective.
Well, IFPRI is working with several countries in introducing new legislations, new framework, to really make sure that some of the new varieties can be used, can be evaluated, to move to the farm field. We are working in Indonesia, in Malawi, Nigeria. So some of the new legislation have been passed. Our program leader, Judy Chamber, under EPTD, Mark and Claudia's leadership. And I think that type of work has potentially high returns. I think you're right. If we have good seeds, high potential in terms of yield, in terms of addressing some of the stresses, but we needed to move them to farm fields. And this policy framework is so critical. Frank, do you have any final 2 or 3 words before I can give a small wrap up?
Well, you've had interesting questions. I don't know if you, in the end, have become convinced of what I started with, that the CGIAR reform is here to stay. But anyway, I appreciate your attention and your interest in the subject. I'll leave it at that.